even if one person withdraws consent, you'll have to delete the whole model.
Like, what's the spirit of the law? Like, what is it that it wants a data fiduciary to do? So I have some questions directly from the field where people have been asking like how to navigate the DPDP Act and rules.
Now, if you can create unrelatable data with, for example, privacy enhancing technologies,
Rules also call out a specific term called consent manager, and I think that has caused a lot of confusion whether a data fiduciary has to be a consent manager as well. Welcome everyone to the PrivaSapien podcast of Unbundling DPDP Act and Rules. This is one of the first episodes of a long series that we are going to be discussing towards how we can unbundle DPDP Act and Rules for our customers. This is going to be a special edition series which will discuss some of the pressing questions, repeating questions that we have been getting from a lot of our partners, customers. We have been visiting them at ministries, consultation, industry conferences, and workshops. And in this series, we'll try to answer a few of them. So my name is Ankit Bajaj, and I have Abhilash Handarajan with me.
Hi.
So Abhilash, let's directly cut to the chase. So I have some questions directly from the field where people have been asking like how to navigate the DPDP Act and rules. So I'll directly start with one of the questions that one of our DPOs was asking, like, hey, like, can you help me understand how do I go about reading the rules?
Awesome. Great to see the excitement in your eyes. And I can understand market is like really excited about the rules which have come and a lot of queries and clarifications which are ongoing. Fortunately, we have been having a very good ringside view of the entire market. And, we've been interacting with a lot of customers, partners. So it's great to have this setup and then have this conversation. Really looking forward to all the questions from the field.
Definitely.
So on the first question, always read it from the last page because that's where the penalty is. And that's what matters, which is very, very important. So from the penalty perspective, which is in the act, so when you look at the schedule for penalty, the highest penalty is for reasonable security safeguards. And the 250 crore penalty is directly for that. If there is a data breach and the reasonable security safeguards are not being put, then the penalty can be up to 250 crore. Okay. This is the highest priority. And even when you look at the act right from the beginning, the focus has always been on the harm which is directly associated to the breach. And the definition of the breach is also very personal data breach is very large. Any unauthorized processing will result in a breach, and any storage, processing, usage of data beyond what is consented, it is considered as a breach. So it's like very, very large, and the personal data is also large. So because of which, when as a DPO, I look at it, I would say I will go to the last page and then see what are the penalties. The 250 crore is for reasonable security safeguards. Then you have to notify breach if you get to know that there is a breach, and that is 200 crore. And that is immediate. So if you got to know and then you are not, immediately letting know the data principal, which is the customer from which you have collected the data, and to the board, then there is additional penalty on top of it.
Okay.
So you have to. So the only way to do is proactively prevent it, because reactively, if you do, it is incentivized in a way that it's going to be really, really harmful for the company. And in 72 hours, if you will have to also say that, okay, these are the steps that we are taking to prevent the subsequent breaches. And these are the controls in place. This is one very important thing. Then you have the requirement for DPIA, which also will be part of the breach notification, where you will say that, okay, these are the data which we approved. And from one of these, some third party breached it. We identified the source. This is the prevention we are putting. So all these things you have to search. So in the DPA also, it becomes your responsibility that you do due diligence in terms of what are the reasonable safeguards you will have to put. It comes back to the reasonable safeguards that we spoke about. So the DPA phase, you will have to say, okay, this is the purpose for which the data was collected. This is the purpose for which the data is being requested. And these are the data minimization techniques that I can apply and provide this minimized data for this purpose.
I like the approach you mentioned that you're reading the bill and the act from the last page. So if I go from that perspective, I think the penalties apply when the board seeks that whether the data fiduciary tried to mitigate the breach or not, what impact the breach could have taken. So in any thoughts on that, like what if you like what would a board try to see in a data fiduciary's attempt to restrict a breach?
Absolutely. So this is also provided in the Act 33 and then 32 as well, where they look at what is the data which has been breached, what is the level of sensitivity of the data, how frequently has this breach happened, and what are the efforts that you have been taking on this, what are you promising now, and what is the significance of the breach and the harm to the subject. They will consider all this, and the maximum penalty is prescribed, but they will consider all this and take an action. So as we were discussing, first is reasonable security safeguard. If you not did 50 crore penalty, that is the root. So hence this is more of a techno legal regulation, because rather than telling people what not to do, this tells people what to do, which is good, because that is the safeguards is what you have to do rather than what you should not do, or what are people's right. If it just stops at what are the rights of the people, it becomes very difficult for you to say how to actually do it. But here it says, we know these are the rights of the people, but this is how you will have to put safeguard, and if you don't do the safeguard, is when the penalty applies. So thus it is bit more mature, and hence it also gives the right guidance. So we spoke about reasonable safeguards, breach notification, and then DPIA. Then subsequently, there is also principals also have to ensure that they are updating their information appropriately where it's important, and they don't create nuisance by doing certain things. That's also there, because abuse is also possible. And then subsequently, everything else in terms of consent, notice, DSR, non-compliance of any of this will attract a penalty of up to 50 crore.
Right.
So this is what the penalty speaks about. So while the earlier, for example, GDPR was a regulation from 2016, almost a decade ago. Now we are in 2025. So the approach for GDPR is very different from a 2025 regulation, where the usage of data is what is very, very critical for the business. Probably they will be doing things on AI, data sharing with multiple parties, doing analytics. So, and then the penalty is also high for processing of the data, the risk which comes from the processing of the data. So they have to put technical safeguards for processing of the data. So that is going to be the key for businesses. How are they going to solve for that problem? And what is in any supply chain? The problem is, you look at the longest, challenge that you have in hand, and then look at smaller ones later. So let us say if you have like even a 2-year time period from now, you should look at what is the biggest challenge in front of you, what is the biggest penalty that you have, and how do you address that. So when you solve the most difficult problem, other things become easy. While in a GDPR kind of an approach, it was very, very different. Okay, you do some discovery, you do some DPA, and then that's it. No mitigation. But this is more mitigation centric. So the approach needs to be that way, because that is where your results are going to be. That's where your ROA is going to be. So hence, there needs to be a different approach depending upon the act. Hence, starting reading from the back that is from the penalty of understanding what is being required for them to do is very, very critical. Else you will do the mundane stuff and end up paying penalty.
So if I understand it correctly, as a DPO, if I have to understand my risks and responsibilities, I start from the back, and that gives me a good clarity where my focus should be.
Correct.
What should be my next steps? Where should I allocate resources, budgeting, probably a metric for that.
Correct. Absolutely.
Now, I see that you have been quoting, I think you have been very well versed with the law and the regulation. You can quote specific items, but a lot of our audiences are not from a legal background, and they are like mostly non-legal. So for them, if you can help them navigate, like what's the spirit of the law? Like what is it that it wants a data fiduciary to do? Maybe in a non-legal manner, if you can explain.
Yeah, understanding the spirit of the act is very important, because even if you don't understand the nuances, still you may end up complying, which is very critical. So the spirit of the act is in 2T, which is about the personal data. What is defined as personal data? This is very important to understand. Personal data is that which directly identifies a person or if the data is somehow relatable to a person. This is the definition of personal data. So when you have this construct in mind, then you can put reasonable safeguards, protections, and all other things around it. And then in subsequently clause 3 of the act, they say that the applicability of the act is only to the personal data, which is either directly identifiable or relatable. Now, this is where we have to dig deeper so that you can understand what is covered and what is not covered in that. And that is actually the spirit of the act. So government actually wants you to be innovative, unlock data in better ways, but they have to protect the privacy angle of it. Hence, they are saying direct and identifier and relatable.
Understood.
Now, these are actually referred in, for example, in the rule 13.5, they are mentioning about what is an identifier. It is not just something like Aadhaar or phone number alone. It can also be application form number, which is unique to a user. So they are saying if there are set of characters and those characters are unique for that user assigned in a process which is connected, or it is in the process of creating, even if you are creating a virtual token which is unique to that person, even in the data processing which you have assigned, these are unique set of characters which are mapped back to that person.
Okay.
So whatever is mapped back or reversible or linkable back to an individual or relatable back to an individual, whichever way, that is called still considered personal data. So even if you encrypt and you have an encryption key based on which the data can be reversed back to an individual, or even if it is tokenized and you have the token mapping back to that name of the person or his mobile number, it is considered as personal data.
So doing an authentication or encryption does not relieve a data fiduciary of the obligations still, right?
Correct.
If I, as a data fiduciary, use a personal data, perhaps I've taken some level of mitigation, it is still personal data.
Absolutely. Why minimizing is an obligation, or purpose limitation, usage limitation, and minimization of data is an obligation. So reasonable security safeguard is an obligation for them to do whenever they are storing, processing, sharing data. It is still personal data. It does not give you an exemption because you have put a safeguard there. Safeguard is mandatory, but it is not an exemption.
So if I have to ask you in a different way, what would be the first principles of for a data fiduciary if they want to align themselves with the spirit of the law? Maybe like good 3-4 points according to you, which a data fiduciary must follow, given that the rules call some of them out. But if you can help explain them, like what exactly a data fiduciary should do to align with the spirit of the law.
Yeah.
First principles.
Yeah. So in terms of first principles, once you understand the spirit of the law, which is if the data is directly identifying a person, or if it is relatable to a person, you will have a lot of business requirement around your ecosystem where you will have to share data with multiple parties. So when you understand the first principle in terms of what is actually required by the law, what you should protect, then you go to the reasonable safeguards, which is actually clause 6 of the rules, where they mention certain things from A to G. So probably you can put this into two categories, which is security and privacy. Okay. So what is difference between security and privacy? Security is protecting data while at rest and in transit before getting access to the data. That is security, like firewall, authentication, encryption, before access, post access, you decrypt and give the person the data. All these are security, basically falling into confidentiality, integrity, availability technologies.
The CAA.
The CAA triad. Now, when you, and this is where 60 also, so when you look at 6 as, the reasonable security safeguards, there are two sections like 6A, B, and C. 6.1 A, B, C. So A is primarily about security measures like encryption, tokenization, and masking and things like those. The problem with these are all these are relatable. While it protects some level of security, these are relatable back to an individual. Because it is relatable back to an individual, if there is a breach, still you will have to report. Even if you have put safeguards, let's say you have encrypted a column and then given to a third party. The third party has breached the data. Okay, though the names and phone numbers are encrypted, it is still considered a breach because that information can sometime, let's say this is permanently getting stored. Because if the data gets breached, this guy is storing it somewhere. Let us say tomorrow he can break that encryption, or your key also gets leaked downstream. Then that person's PII will be released and will be available to a downstream party, an attacker. So it is considered a personal data breach if it is in a re-identifiable form or relatable form, or only security measures are put against 6A is put against it. Now there is one more clause, which is 6(1)(d), which speaks about reasonable measures beyond the CAA measures. So if there is a CAA compromise, let us say you have encrypted the feed and this information has got breached or this information has got compromised. For example, you have inputted the key and then said it to everybody. Now the key has got compromised, key has got leaked, or there is a firewall which is actually protecting your data, that firewall got compromised, or there is an admin username and password that is used for everybody admin to log into very sensitive information, that got somehow leaked. He kept it wrote it and kept it somewhere, that somebody took a picture, put it on social media. Right? Or he has put it in a GitHub, which was made public. So, people got access and, people you don't know, and then there was a breach and you don't even know. Right? Now, these are examples of compromises. How do you protect beyond the compromise? Is a very core principle, and this is what is reflected in the definition of personal data, the definition of data protection, like the data breach, personal data breach as well. Once again, in the personal data breach, they speak about CAA, compromise of CAA, even in definition of personal data breach, in the definition. So, that is a very continuous thought process. Even when Minister Honorable Mr. Ashwini Vaishnav spoke about this, he told that you will have to read the act and the rule together. So when we speak about breach, for example, section 7 in the rules speaks about the breach. And when you speak about the breach, first to even understand the breach, you will have to go back to the act and you will have to look at the definition of the breach, personal data breach, which speaks about unauthorized accessing of the data, including the compromise of CAA. Okay. So security is considered as compromisable, and you are supposed to take actions which are reasonable measures even beyond a CAA breach. And they are given an example of availability in the CAA triad, but the bigger challenges are around confidentiality and integrity. How do you ensure confidentiality and integrity beyond a breach? Okay. Which mandates or which sort of enables you to think that when you are doing data minimization, the dissociation, the more you do the dissociation, the better it is for you. So if somebody is requesting for you for data, you cannot just mask data and give, because you may be the only person with a specific date of birth in your apartment. They have to just take a voter ID data set, map it, and then they can easily get your name back if your name alone is masked. But if all your information is masked, then the data also loses utility, cannot be of any help in a business scenario. So they have to put techniques which are in line with this beyond CAA kind of consideration. This is where NIST kind of frameworks come in, where NIST privacy framework speaks about exactly this requirement of how do you protect data beyond CAA, how security is different and privacy is separate. And in beyond CAA is where your PMD comes in, which is PMD is predictability, manageability, and dissociability. Predictability is something like privacy threat modeling, where you try to understand what is the level of risk present in this data. Okay. Then manageability is how can I configure to mitigate that risk. And the actual mitigation is dissociability. which is basically you are dissociating the data from the individual with technologies, primarily privacy enhancing technology.
So in context to that, so if I have to understand correctly, a data fiduciary has to do a lot of activities. Like there are a lot of continuous business processes that they need to be cognizant of, that has to run, they have to be operational, the process can't go down, right? And with DPDP Act and rules coming in and asking them to do, let's say, consented processing, DPIA, safeguarding, right? So how can a fiduciary make it, like a DPO can make it easy for their enterprise, or the data fiduciary can make it easy for them to understand these processes, and what, like you were mentioning some technologies that can help you beyond CIA, so which I'm rephrasing it to, let's say, beyond security, what do you have to protect your data? So if you could name some technologies, if you could help understand what is beyond CIA, and perhaps explain how can all of these consented DPIA, data safeguarding, can be eased out for a data fiduciary?
Absolutely, because the biggest headache is all this data is covered under the regulation, under DPDP, and the obligations are very high. So the answer goes back to the definition of personal data, which is 2P, where personal data is that which is directly like identifiable and relatable. The third category is unrelatable, which it is not under the applicable scope of the act. So if you make the data unrelatable to an individual, then the data is not covered under the act, or it's not applicable to the act.
So that reduces a DPO's headache. So if a data is, let's say, not covered under the act, DPO or a data fiduciary doesn't have to bother about it.
Yes, pretty much, because it is not applicable under the act, right? So this is what reflects in multiple places, and this is lot of places these are interconnected as well. So personal data can be put into identifiable data, relatable data, and unrelatable data. Okay. Now, if you can create unrelatable data with, for example, privacy enhancing technologies, then the data, the DPDP Act is not applicable for the data, and you get, like, you can process the data in multiple ways, especially, for example, continuous processing, or let us say you have to give a data to, let us say, a third party analytics company or a business analyst who may not have direct consent for processing the data or any lawful purpose for processing the data, in which case you can't even give the data. Okay. Then how will the business run? Which will become a big problem. So if you do this, make the data unrelatable, and if you can provide mathematical guarantees of it, then the data is exempt and you can do continuous processing of the data. For example, there are technologies, and for example, this is very, very popular. Gartner says that PET is one of the top strategic technologies for this decade. UN has come up with a separate PET labs where they are doing significant research on this. US has also included this. NIST has also spoken about this. UK government has come up with a separate paper on this. So this is like a very, very foundational technology which enables people to solve for this problem and unlock data for multiple purposes. Now, when you integrate this, and this has to be integrated across the journey, starting from notice, consent. So you will have to check when you do DPIA, and this has to be connected across the life cycle of the data. You cannot do it separately. So this has to be connected right at the consent and the DPIA level. At the consent level, it is already very, very specific. It has to be provable, verifiable, withdrawable, right? All these requirements are there. So, and the data is also limited for a limited time period. You cannot take the data forever. If you want to, let's say, if a user is, for example, there is an illustration where if user is booking a table in a restaurant or something, the number can be stored only till the time that reservation is applicable. After that, you'll have to delete the number, right? Because then you may share to get to know a lot of other information. So when this is happening, the duration of the data in the identifiable or relatable form is very, very short. It is almost ephemeral, right? So if you want to do archiving or statistical processing and things like those, or share data to a third party where CA compromise may happen, then in all these scenarios, you will have to make the data unrelatable so that the data is does not fall under the applicability of that, because it cannot cause harm to an individual.
I think that's also called out as a part of the there's an exemption for using unrelatable data in the DPDP.
Correct. So exemption is very a different, a separate scenario which has been called out, where either for research purposes or statistical processing or archiving, if you are using data, then there is a direct exemption. But it should be it should not be relatable to a person. That is what is quoted in 72B. Okay. Then they have told that the explanation of it will come in the rules. And in the rules, 15, the clause 15 or section 15 speaks about this, which is then subsequently explained in, schedule 2. And in schedule 2, in F, it speaks about reasonable security safeguards, which comes back to 6D. Okay. In 6D, because 6D is the only continuous processing, because archiving, research, all these are continuous processes beyond consent. Okay. So thus, this completes the cycle and comes back to 6D, where for continuous processing, how do you retain the data which is not relatable to an individual is where it comes. Hence, understanding the spirit of the act is very important, because this solves your headache for continuous processing of the data in your business ecosystem.
So, Abhilash, so far we have talked about the journey of the data. So, what a data fiduciary gets it and how he should be handling, or he or she should be handling the data, and then pass it on to the data processor, and what are the safeguards they need to put in. But there is also another aspect that is there, where a data fiduciary interacts with the end user or the customer whose data they are collecting in the form of consent, right? Although the act talks about how to collect the consent and what form you can collect and what is the basic attributes of a consent should be, but rules also call out a specific term called consent manager. And I think that has caused a lot of confusion, whether a data fiduciary has to be a consent manager as well, or who can be a consent manager, right? So if you can maybe put some clarification on that, like how a data fiduciary should go about this.
Yeah. So data fiduciaries don't need to have consent manager. Okay. As per the regulation, consent manager is more like a consent aggregator. And the confusion is because market already has a terminology for consent manager, which is related to consent collector. Okay. So because regulation has used the terminology consent manager for consent aggregator, there is a confusion. So this is primarily for consortiums or ecosystems, where let us say there is a consortium of banks which want to share data amidst them, or a consortium of insurance companies or banks and insurance companies, things like those. In this scenario, if customer can give consent to one party and enable data flow to the other party, the consent manager can be a single consent manager for this consortium for data exchange. This is obvious from the illustrations of the consent manager from the rule, where it is primarily if you are to give data from a something like a DigiLocker to a bank, there will be a centralized entity which is like almost like a quasi-governmental entity, or it requires high level of regulatory constraint. It should not have any conflict of interest and things like those, and it should be blind to data, and there are certain obligations and requirements have been called out. So this will be somebody like a Sahamati or a account aggregator ecosystem, where the data will flow from one party to the other party. For example, the Sahamati ecosystem is, while banks have to collect consent for themselves, which is mandatory, but so they need to have a consent collector in their ecosystem, or any data fiduciary need to have a consent, provide notice and collect consent from the data principal. This is mandatory. But if there is a collaborative ecosystem where you will have to create new services, data sharing services, and this idea comes from the digital public infrastructure of India. So this is a great initiative by the government, where they want to build a data exchange ecosystem on top of Aadhaar and UPI, where enable different verticals to share data, collaborate data with different parties. Now, Sahamati is a great example. In a banking ecosystem, let us say you have a bank account with Bank 1 and you want to ask for loan with Bank 2. So today you will have to give a document to Bank 2, like let's say your banking statement to Bank 2 of Bank 1. Now, you could have manipulated the statement also. So they have to go back and verify, and it will take its own time. It will delay the loan processing, and it will make the whole system inefficient. So to make this efficient, there is an intermediary or there is a consent manager who will collect the consent for you and then share the consent to bank one, and then enable bank one to securely share that information to which he will be blind to directly to bank two. So bank two is directly getting the information from the source. You will not be giving the document to bank two. They will directly get from bank one, enabled by the consent manager, but consent manager will not be able to see that information.
So if, let's say, I'm a data fiduciary today and we want to kickstart our DPDP journey, and there are not many consent aggregators today, maybe for the specific domain or for the specific industry. So how do a data fiduciary, or like let's say an SDF, because the act says that the SDF has to roll out notices and have the opt-in opt-out mechanisms in place so that they can get the right consent while they continue to process the data, because the act is in force. So how do a data fiduciary or a significant data fiduciary go about this? Because the consent aggregators are not there yet for every ecosystem.
Consent collection is mandatory, while consent manager is not mandatory. So what data fiduciary should do is they should go ahead and have solutions for giving notice to a user and collecting consent, and then only they should collect data and process data with necessary reasonable security safeguard
Alongside the data principal rights as well?
Yeah, along with the data principal rights. So that is mandatory. Now, what is critical is, so in any of this, consent manager is not mandatory at all. That is a separate path for an ecosystem to develop when there are multiple parties involved. It will happen over a period of time. As a data fiduciary, let us say as an e-commerce company or as a manufacturing company or as a bank or a financial institution, you need a consent collection process in place. Not any business, whether you are a significant data fiduciary or not. As per the clause 6 of that, consent collection and limited processing is a fundamental requirement, and it's a fundamental right of the data principal as well. So you will have to put systems in place to give notice to the customer, collect affirmative specific consent from the user, which should be provable that you have given notice, you have received consent,
as well.
and it is verifiable if there is like parental consent and things involved. So this has to be like, because there is a level of trust also, conflict of interest also in place, where you are holding the consent, you can change the consent anytime you want. You may say, hey, you consented for sales also, marketing also. So there should be some proof with the customer also. Then it is like, provable as well, that you had given the notice, he has given the consent, and this proof should be with both parties, and based on which you can then process the data subsequently.
So if I look at it from a holistic perspective, on one side you have the data with you, make it unrelatable, kind of unlocking it from DPDP and use it for multiple purposes. And on one side, the personal data that you have should have the consent and the appropriate purposes for which you have collected for it should be also adhered to. And putting them together is what the essence of DPDP is. While we touched upon the data processing side of things, the consent collection side of things, I would also like to pick your brain for another aspect which is emerging now, that I can say this fairly, that every company is now becoming an AI company, right? So how do they go about it? Because now, like, every company wants to do some initiative with Gen AI, Llama, OpenAI. So how can they go about undergoing their journey for AI while being compliant to DPDP and perhaps the upcoming India AI Act?
Absolutely. So 12.3 in terms of the significant data fiduciary requirement speaks about algorithmic software and the data fiduciary's responsibility to ensure that none of the data principal rights are violated in the process. So the fundamental problem with AI is that once you train a model, then you cannot unlearn things from a model. So let us say today I am customer of a bank and I have given information to the bank, and tomorrow I may close my account and then I may withdraw consent for specific purposes. Of course, there are some lawful purposes. AI is certainly not a lawful purpose. So if you have taken the data and then trained a model and I have withdrawn consent, it can be e-commerce, it can be social media, it can be banking, insurance, whatever, it doesn't matter. You should not be processing my data for model training, but you already trained the model. You cannot delete the information from the model. This becomes a big problem. So how do you solve for it? That is where the 12.3 comes into picture, where you are asked to do things which will ensure that this data principal rights are protected, which is basically, right to withdrawal of consent. Then it becomes a continuous process. It once again goes to 60, or you will have to make it unrelatable. Only then you should be even taking the data to model training. Because if you train the data on identifiable or relatable data, then you will be violating data principals rights when consent is withdrawn.
So it's all tying back to the consent. Either take consent for the processing or make it unrelatable for processing such as AI.
There is one more nuance, right? Like for AI, consent is not good enough. Because the problem is, if you have just dependent on consent and you have used the data, tomorrow he can withdraw the consent as well. And when they withdraw the consent, you will not be able to delete that information from the model. While you can delete it from a database, you cannot delete it from a model. And hence, you will have to, even if one person withdraws consent, you will have to delete the whole model, which you will have put like a lot of GPUs to train on. Right? That becomes a huge problem. So hence, you will have to use technologies like PET to unlock the data, make it unrelatable, and only then you should be using it for model training.
Understood. One last question, Abhilash. We touched upon all the aspects, right? We talked about understanding the regulation. We talked about the risk and responsibilities of a DPO, of a CISO, right? We touched upon how you go about consented processing, how you go about unrelatable data, about AI. Now, would like to know from you, as PrivaSapien, right? How can PrivaSapien help a company comply with DPDP with all these aspects touching upon, right? I mean, it's a broad spectrum, right? So, would like to know from that perspective how PrivaSapien is enabling enterprises in that way.
Absolutely. PrivaSapien has been working on this for past 4 years. Probably we are getting into the 5th year now. So we help end to end in compliance with DPDP, right from consent, providing notice, collecting consent, and making it provable and verifiable and withdrawable as per the regulatory requirements, doing DPAA for significant data fiduciary, recommending mapping it against India's DPDP Act and rules, and making automated intelligent recommendations, making DPAA process much more simpler and faster, and integrating this into the data flows so that you can apply techniques for reasonable security safeguards or also for continuous processing, and thus make the data also unrelatable, thus unlock the data, build practices and services in the business ecosystem so that you can unlock data and also build models for value creation. So we cover the entire cycle from privacy management to privacy threat modeling to privacy enhancing technologies to responsible AI technologies in a single platform, which can be a life changer for the DPOs, because you get everything in a single place, including DPO, data governance team, responsible AI team or the AI team, and the CIO's office.
Awesome. I think those were some of the questions from the ground, Abhilash, and thank you so much for answering some of them in very detail. I think it helps our audience also to get a good understanding and initiate the DPDP Act and rules, and perhaps get them with some sort of technological understanding as well. So thank you so much, Abhilash. It was nice talking to you, and look forward to further more episodes.
Absolutely. Looking forward to continuous engagement with our audience and keep sharing our thoughts. Please feel free to drop your queries and comments. Looking forward to interacting with you further. Thank you.